Hey everybody, Jason Blaha here with Ice Cream Fitness. I'm just sitting here eating an ice cream Twix bar. Nice to combine, candy and ice cream together at the same time. And let me give you guys a bicep shot. Today I want to talk to you guys about training frequency and explain to you why I advocate high frequency training based upon both science and history. The funny thing is, though, when we look at this topic, interestingly enough, if anabolic steroids were the strongest drug used in bodybuilding, and that's all that we had ever invented and nothing else came out, we actually wouldn't even be having this conversation, because you didn't even see championship winning bodybuilders even placing at the Mr. Olympia who didn't train each body part 3 times a week when steroids were the only drugs used. You just didn't see that happen because they weren't able to get big enough when they reduced training frequency in order to be able to compete at that level. The drugs just weren't strong enough to allow them to grow quickly enough to reach their goals. And honestly, if it wasn't for the discovery of the anabolic properties of insulin and how it stacks with steroids and amplifies their effects, we would never have even seen this body part split, or as I like to call them, bro splits, being used in professional level bodybuilding. The champions wouldn't be able to develop the physiques that they need to win if insulin had not been added to their stacks, if it hadn't been discovered just how anabolic it is, how it can extend protein synthesis. And if it wasn't for that, this would be a completely dead topic. We wouldn't even have to have this conversation. Everyone would be training their body parts 3 times a week still. Some advanced people would drop to twice a week, and we wouldn't even be having this conversation at all. So it's really, you have to blame insulin for this even being a topic of debate, and for natural bodybuilders to have ever even heard of the concept of a body part split or even consider implementing it. It would never have happened because it would have been understood to be an inferior method that would cause slower growth. And this is not to say that you can't get to your goals with it. Using this type of training is, again, you'll see many guys out there who go, well, I use body part splits and, be big and pretty strong and have a nice physique. But it's like when you ask them how long it took them to get there, it's like 7 or 8 years. And the question becomes, could they have done the same thing in 5 years instead of 7 or 8? And I would say most likely yes, with a better approach. And the reason for that being falls back to what I've addressed on this topic before of protein synthesis. When you train a muscle, the muscle protein synthesis is elevated as a result of the training, and then it returns to baseline anywhere between 28 and 48 hours after you train a muscle, at which point you stop growing. Once the muscle protein synthesis returns to baseline, you're no longer seeing growth in that muscle as a result of training. So you, at the very most, if you train your biceps or your chest, they are only going to grow for up to, at the very most, 48 hours before they completely stop growing as a result of that session. And so historically, it was always noted for decades that training a body part 3 times a week, or just training your full body Monday, Wednesday, Friday, was the approach that seemed to yield the best results. Guys got bigger and stronger faster training that way. As bodybuilding evolved, bodybuilders started experimenting with different methods outside of that, even in the 60s and 70s, and you saw a lot of this. But what you oftentimes saw was an attempt to add more volume, because you would often run into problems of, yes, you could get more muscle growth uptime, as a result of training 3 times a week, but oftentimes guys weren't necessarily growing for the full 48 hours, and so then they still had downtime. And you saw guys like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but also, again, he was using, drugs to allow him to train at a much, much higher volume and still recover, but at the same time, he was able to do enough sets per session by splitting things up, to where he would train twice a day and run 4 different routines and then repeat them, so that each routine was done 3 times a week, split up over 12 different training sessions. So he would actually have something like 12 training sessions of repeating 4 different routines 3 times throughout the week, running 2-a-days. And that sort of thing was very popular in that time period, so that guys could get sets per body part in which is enough to, stimulate 48 hours of growth and repeat the process so that they were continually growing. And then, of course, they used hefty amounts of anabolics to recover from such a heavy workload. But you didn't see guys reducing the frequency until the drug doses started getting higher and higher and newer drugs started being added to the stacks. You didn't really see guys deviating away from that 3 times a week. And then as we got into the 80s, you started seeing twice a week. And then when we got into the 90s, when guys started adding, insulin to their already existing, steroid and growth hormone stacks, then we started seeing this deviation away from the high frequency training in the ranks of pro bodybuilding, which then of course trickles down through magazines and fitness culture into the mainstream. And then you have naturals and the layperson then using training methods that still get them results, but they're going to be slower and they're therefore inferior results. You then see that brought down into the mainstream, and it becomes very popular. But interestingly enough, there's still been in recent years, it's been kind of an upswing back towards a higher frequency again, because even the bigger guys are realizing that they need to train some of their body parts, if not all of them, twice a week, sometimes to get as big as possible, even on the drugs. And so again, it's even though we saw this emerge out of the 90s, Ronnie Coleman comes to mind as training with a higher frequency than what the other pros are doing, even with all of their drugs. And then, like again, Phil Heath recently trains body parts twice a week. We can't even say with certainty that even at the top levels that you want to take 7 days between body parts. So when you factor in the protein synthesis, it becomes apparent that for most individuals, you really want to hit a body part 3 times a week. One of the things that becomes immediately apparent for both the novice and the intermediate trainee is that there's a huge workload difference and progressive overload difference also when you start training each body part 3 times a week, because generally at that level they're able to progress faster session to session. And what you'll actually see is that not only do you have the more frequent protein synthesis and therefore more growth up time, but what you also see is that they can produce a higher workload throughout the week. Because generally speaking, people in that range, people who have only been lifting weights for 6 months, a year, 2 years, don't have a great deal of training stamina yet. They're not able to crank out 10 sets for a body part or a given lift and still maintain 95% of the intensity that they had on the first set. They run out of steam really, really quickly. Whereas in more advanced trainees, sometimes they might only have to take 5 pounds off of the bar to do 9 or 10 sets and hit the same reps they did, early on, because they have developed a large amount of training stamina. So one of the things you see with these people early on is that if you were to try to do 15 sets of bench press in one session, you're only going to get 5 or 6 good sets, and then you completely run out of steam, and you're not really getting that much workload for the additional sets. Whereas if you broke it up into 3 different sessions, you'd have to be just bench press for those, some other sort of press for your chest. It could be, incline dumbbell presses or whatever, that you were able to take the 15 sets that you do, even if you've done other body parts before, like squats, you're still going to be able to generate a lot more force and use a lot heavier weight with those 15 sets if spread out over the week. And so you're going to get a higher workload, which again stacks with and has a synergistic effect with the fact that you have more elevated protein synthesis. So I mean, there are multiple reasons why you have benefits to doing that. And now when we get into debates on some of this as to where the more advanced lifter, if they need to cut down to 2 sessions, and actually, I mean, I've seen Lyle McDonald put out some material on this, and he's pointed to studies that seem to indicate that for more advanced bodybuilders and advanced athletes, that training a muscle group more than twice a week doesn't seem to elicit any additional growth. And there can be a number of factors behind this. And the first one that I will point out is obviously that advanced lifters are gaining muscle so slow that it might not actually be measurable in the short period of time that they're using, because they're gaining muscle so slowly. So if they're only gaining, maybe 20% more muscle per 6 months as a result of training that extra session per week, it might be too small to actually measure. Even though we know you're going to have more protein synthesis up time, it's still so small that they're missing it with the static in this few studies that they've done on this. So that's something to consider. And the other thing, of course, to consider is that at a certain threshold, the advanced lifter has a much higher training stamina, and they're able to crank out a sustained workload with up to 9 or 10 sets per body part. And so what you can see there is that if that lifter were to cut down to doing 5 sets for some sort of chest press 3 times a week, sure, they're stimulating the growth, but because that is a relatively low volume, and it might be a relatively low volume in terms of what they're capable of generating, they might be closer to that 28 to 30 hour window rather than the full 48 hours. And so when they're doing 3 times a week, they may only be getting 70 to 80 hours of actual protein synthesis. Whereas if they were to cut back to, upper lower or push-pull split and train 4 days a week, some of those individuals are able to sustain a heavy workload for 10 full sets and sustain nearly their same weights they were able to on the first set, and therefore achieve a full 48 hours and hit the other extreme end of that muscle protein synthesis window, and in which case they may actually be getting just as much protein synthesis uptime depending on what sort of workloads they can handle. And so that really begs the question of at what point should the advanced lifter consider cutting back to twice a week? And even though I personally still, as an advanced lifter, I still do the 3 time a week full body thing, I could probably get away with switching over to this myself because I'm capable of sustaining near maximum intensity for up to 10 sets. And so I could probably come in and split it up into 4 days and do 20 sets of chest presses twice a week and actually, hit pretty high amounts of protein synthesis uptime and probably get just as much growth, but I just happen to prefer doing it the other way, so I stick with that. But there is a legitimate case to be made for the fact that when you're able to sustain a high workload with a relatively heavy weight for a large number of sets, that there can be possible advantages, or at least getting equal growth by switching to something like an upper or lower push-pull split and switching to 4 days a week instead of 3 full bodies. So there is a legitimate case for that. And I think in that case it requires you to really look at personal preference, look at the way that you prefer to train, what you're comfortable with, or to experiment back and forth and see what sort of progress you make. So again, even though I advocate the 3 time a week, there is certainly a strong case to be made both logically, historically, and scientifically for more advanced lifters switching over to something like an upper lower split with a twice a week frequency per body part and lift. And so again, you have to really look at that at the individual level to figure out what's right for that person, or what's right for you personally when you get to that point. But I will say that if you have only been lifting for 1 to 2 years, you are shortchanging yourself if you switch away from a full body 3 time a week training style, unless you just absolutely cannot stand it and you need the psychological motivation of something different, in which case you have to do what you have to do to stay motivated. Because at the end of the day, the person who trains the hardest and is motivated and consistently trains harder and harder and progresses on their overload and is motivated is going to make better progress than the next guy who might be on what is an optimal and perfect routine for him, but he half-asses it. So you have to do what you have to do to stay motivated. And I hope this has been informative. Let me give you guys another bicep shot. Well, and that's all I have to say on that. I'll talk to you next time.